Good evening. Welcome to Women's Week 1976. In addition to this evening's lecture, there have been many workshops, films, and special events, and will continue to be some throughout Saturday. I hope that you will avail yourself to those you find of interest. Programs are available at the door. There's also a hospitality house in the YWCA, which is a place to drop by, have some food. This is not turned on. Can you hear?
Turn on the other mic.
Hello. Is that better? Oh, good evening. Okay, there's a hospitality house at the YWCA where you can stop by for discussion, food, and information about various women's groups in this area. Tonight is, I'd like to mention, first of all, some things coming up tomorrow. In the afternoon, from 1 to 3:30 in room 205-206 of the Memorial Union, there will be a workshop called How to Change What You Don't Like in Your Community, and that will be led by Peg Cass of the Iowa Women's Political Caucus. Tomorrow evening is a feature-length film in the Gallery of the Union, Gertrude Stein, When This You See, Remember Me. And on Saturday, there are 3 workshops. One is from 10 to 3 in room 205-206 of the Union, Changing Lifestyles in Midstream. Another one from 10 to 12 in the YWCA, Sex and Your Head. And the third from 1 to 3 in the YWCA, the Women's Community Health Center will give a presentation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Ann Feierherm, who is the coordinator of academic programs at Iowa State University. Ann?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't have all the academic programs, but I do have special programs. And I am also delighted to have a special guest here this evening who you're all waiting to hear from. So I'll make this very brief. I've been following Sheila around, being her shadow or whatever, for about a day and a quarter. And I found Sheila to be a most energetic, dynamic, fun-loving, and also very serious at times woman who I'm really pleased to have with us tonight. She's a feminist educator, and she practices her feminist educational tactics or policies as the associate provost at Connecticut Wesleyan. She was active in the development of women's studies programs in the 70s, but in the last 2 years she's directed her attention to mathematics, avoidance, and anxiety, and that is the topic of her lecture tonight. So I would like you to join me in welcoming a very dynamic woman, Sheila Tobias.
This is my first trip here to your campus, and I want to compliment you on its loveliness and on the friendliness of the people I've met so far. This evening I want to talk to you about a subject that if someone had asked me 2 years ago that I'd be interested in, I would have been very disbelieving. Like so many women, I am a mathematics avoider, not awfully good at simple arithmetic, certainly not at complex mathematical work, though as an administrator and as an adult I have had to get some training in mathematics, statistics, enough to deal with specialists in computers, and I would never have thought I'd become anything like an expert in math education. But I've become something of an expert in math education because I think there's a major problem out there that feminists and women of all persuasions really need to address. Let me tell you how I got interested in the subject, what we're doing about it at my university, what we think we have to sell or to market elsewhere in the country, and then take some questions or open this up for discussion. In the past 12 or 14 years, since the Equal Pay Act went into effect and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 began to end, or at least reduce discrimination against women in employment, we have seen some achievements, some advantages, some improvements in the situation of women in employment, which are quite measurable, and I do think we have come some way. But there's one fact, one statistical truth, that I find extremely disturbing and is very much related to my talk tonight and my interest in mathematics. And that is the index of occupational segregation by sex. There's a way of measuring the degree to which occupations in this country are segregated by sex, and economists call it a Occupational Segregation Index, and they apply this index to race and they apply it to the male-female relations. And what it refers to is the tendency to be tracked into certain professions and within large organizations into certain kinds of jobs that are considered normal or appropriate for women, or in the case of racial minorities, normal or appropriate for Black and Chicano men and women. And what is so very disturbing is that despite the achievements of the 60s and 70s in reducing discrimination, the Occupational Segregation Index, as far as women and men is concerned, has not changed at all since 1916. Now, what that means is that our accomplishments have been limited in their thoroughgoingness. Or to say it differently, I think this country has come to accept the principle of equal opportunity for women, but not a far more profound and radical principle, the principle of interchangeability of women and men, that women and men can interchangeably do all manner of work, of creative effort, of professional and other sort of occupational endeavors. And I think that the reluctance to accept the interchangeability of men and women is really the challenge of the 70s. I think the equality principle has been accepted in theory, if not always in practice, but the interchangeability principle is still out there to be won. And that occupational segregation is the manner in which this culture continues to treat women as fundamentally different from men. Now, the problems with occupational segregation are fairly obvious. Not only are women tracked into certain occupations, those occupations are low in value, they are less well paid, and it's only in this context that we can begin to understand why, in the face of reduced discrimination, we still have a widening gap in earnings between men and women. It isn't that they're getting differential payment for the same jobs, it is that they are getting different jobs. And the curious thing is that as new occupations come into play, they will be segregated, they will be tracked as masculine or feminine at certain points, even when those designations change. To wit, programming in the computer industry, which initially was a fairly androgynous occupation, men and women both being attracted to programming, has now become, at least at the lower, simpler levels in business programming, a woman's occupation. Or librarianship, which was predominantly a female occupation, where it is data retrieval and has to do with technical support systems. It is an occupation into which men are going. So one major problem in the continued occupational segregation is clearly the fact that it leads to differential wages and lower status for women. But another problem that I consider even more significant for androgyny or equality is the fact that to the extent we see men and women doing different jobs in the workforce, our prejudices about their differences and their lack of interchangeability is reinforced. And so it appears non-normal for women to be in certain occupations and non-normal for men to be in others. Adult males and females do not get the experience of working together as colleagues in similar occupations, and at the very moment we are working so hard to change sex stereotyping in children's books, in the media, in movies, we are at the same time reinforcing sex stereotyping on the workforce. So I was concerning myself 2.5 years ago with the problem that I named occupational segregation, along with many other women in the movement and many other serious economists, when a piece of data from the University of California at Berkeley came to my attention, which caused me to shift very much my analysis of the causes of the problem. I had noted, as an educator, as you must have noted, that women tend to move into the humanities, into the softer social sciences, into elementary education, guidance counseling, and numerous occupations of that sort. And I had assumed, given my analysis of the culture, that the reason for this tracking was sex role pressure. Pressure from peers, from parents, from teachers, on women to go into female-appropriate professions, the helping professions, the supportive professions, the professions dealing with people where social skills are very valuable, and away from professions that are defined arbitrarily by our culture as masculine. But when I read a short memorandum, still unpublished, though I've had it retyped and I send it out widely, by Lucy Sells, a sociologist at Berkeley, I had to change my understanding of the causes. Sells did a very simple count of the incoming freshmen and freshwomen at Berkeley in 1972, that is well into present history, when the movement and ideas about equality of men and women were quite widespread, certainly at Berkeley, and found that 57% of the incoming males were arriving with 4 years of high school mathematics preparation, and that only 8% of the females at this rather fine college were arriving with comparable mathematics preparation. She further noted that at Berkeley, in order to enter the calculus sequence and to take rigorous courses in statistics and to do well in basic science courses, you needed to have at least those 4 years of math. And so she, continuing her analysis, noted that 92% of the females entering Berkeley were ineligible from the outset from calculus and statistics and science. And further, that without calculus or statistics or introductory science, these 92% of all females were ineligible in turn for 15 out of 20 majors at Berkeley. And further, that the 5 majors remaining that they could select, given their inadequate mathematics background, were the majors in those fields that we both classify as the sex stereotyped, the early childhood education, guidance, foreign languages, history and literature, and also that they were the occupations that were most crowded, particularly at the graduate level, and the occupations which were facing the most severe retrenchment. So I was forced, in the face of her observation, to recast my own thinking about occupational segregation, and to see it no longer entirely in terms of a pressure upon women to select occupations that suit their so-called feminine characteristics, but as really a mechanism for avoiding work in the area of quantitative analysis. That led, of course, to the next question, why? And on the surface, we know that mathematics, science, quantitative areas are designated as masculine in our culture, but why, in the face of all the debate and the consciousness raising and the discussion, why, first of all, had this problem gone unnoticed, and why were young women today, who seem to be talking about having careers and talking about having rich lives that went beyond the home, why were women today still avoiding mathematics? And with that question in mind, I began to do a little thinking. Mathematics avoidance was the name of the problem, and to account for it, we began to question and query and investigate and talk to women students and adult women on our campus about their feelings about mathematics. And it turned out that the problem was even more serious than we had imagined, because their feelings seemed to be non-rational. Going to a group of women students in a dormitory and talking to them realistically about mathematics as a critical filter in vocational choice, or about the probability that whatever their entry-level job, they might along the way wish to become promoted into budget making or planning or operations functions that would require quantitative analysis, it seemed to fall on very deaf ears. And not among the most conformist young women, even among the most radical young women. In fact, in the feminist movement itself at the time, I was getting flack from radical sisters, colleagues of mine, who were arguing that to opt for the technical professions or technical training was to buy into a masculine system, was to accept male values, and that what we women in education ought to be doing was to be increasing the opportunities in the humanities for women who have humanistic skills, and allowing women freely to avoid mathematics and science. So I had a little bit of flack from the left wing, if you like. I was probably called the right-wing deviationist for a while, until I better formulated the problem. Eventually, we decided that the problem on the emotional level can best be designated as mathematics anxiety, and that it can best be understood as an emotional response, disproportionately evident in females, to a series of events in the learning cycle that cause them to believe they have no talent, no aptitude, no interest, and no future in any of the mathematical fields. And to define it that way was to run in the face of a lot of mythology about women and about mathematics. It might interest you to know that there's a body of literature and a group of very serious scholars, some of them, most of them with PhDs, who believe that mathematics ability is carried on the X chromosome, and that we are congenitally, genetically prevented from learning mathematics. That group seems not to be bothered by the data that shows that 10% of all the PhDs given in mathematics are given to women. Somehow they have a way of accounting for those exceptions. But there is a body of opinion out there that firmly holds to this belief. There's another body of opinion that's perhaps less exaggerated and laughable, but very widespread, that believes that some people have a mathematical mind and some people do not have a mathematical mind, and that the process of going to school and learning mathematics is really a kind of waiting game until you find out that you don't have one. And that occurs at some point, for some in 6th grade with word problems, for some with algebra, for some with calculus. And that along the way, each of us peels off like some kind of planes in formation going on a bombing mission and gives up on our mathematics, and that too is natural. I enjoy telling my mathematics colleagues at my university that when a student does badly in a history exam, that's the subject I generally teach, it never dawns on me or the student to believe that this student doesn't have a historical mind. It's such an absurd assumption. We know why they did badly. They didn't study properly. They didn't work hard enough. They didn't rewrite their paper enough times. They didn't retain what they read. But it never dawns on anyone to assume that there's a mental capability absent in this student called a historical sense. And similarly, I selected the hypothesis that until the evidence is in, there probably isn't anything like a mathematical mind up to and through college-level calculus. I don't, of course, needless to say, there are creative mathematicians who have talents that the rest of us don't have, and they appropriately go on to do creative work in mathematics. But as far as the college level is concerned, anyone, I hypothesized, smart enough and disciplined enough to get into college ought to be smart enough and disciplined enough to get through any of the quantitative material provided in the first 2 or 3 years. So the question was what to do about it. Now, there are 2 ways always to handle a problem. One is to research it, do very thoroughgoing analyses of causation, set up control groups, study people, study situations, and slowly come up with some typology of causation. But that didn't suit my temperament or my politics. I'm far too impatient, and I saw the problem worsening as I sat around and thought about it. So we decided at Wesleyan to go another route and to do something called intervention research. And for those of you in the research business, intervention research is sometimes called quick and dirty research. It is quick and it's very dirty. That means that it's sloppy and there's no perfect research design and you're not always sure what you're getting. But the advantage is you're doing something. And I wrote a proposal, got some money to do the following. The first thing we did was to name our problem mathematics anxiety and to try to make explicit the issue. A lot of people were unwilling to discuss it because it is so emotion-ridden, and we had to do a good deal of announcing of this problem even to get people to agree that they might have it. The second thing we decided to do was to open up on our campus, putting out a shingle, much in the way a new lawyer in town might do, a mathematics anxiety clinic. Now, the reason we chose clinic was to express what we thought was a way of responding to the problem, namely that it wasn't entirely a cognitive problem, but it was emotional, and that a clinic, being a non-threatening place to which people go with problems, might be an appropriate housing for something like math anxiety. An alternative approach might have been just to offer a remedial course, or to talk about review sessions, or to offer tutorial, and we were unwilling to do that. So we announced the establishment of a math anxiety clinic at the university, open to undergraduates and adult women in the community, undergraduate males as well, I might add, and then proceeded to adapt the space we were given in the Science Tower to our needs. Our first problem instantly was the space. I don't know if you have a science tower here that looks like our science tower, but modern and expensive though it is, it's cement blocks, it's very sterile, no rugs on the floor, no green plants, no coffee pot, and we had to bring our own sense of what we were doing into that space, so we redecorated, and that was very significant, a place where people who are not happy in mathematics could come and feel somewhat at home. The second thing we did was to staff it, not with mathematicians really, but with a combination of math teachers and counselors, actual therapists who were willing to do a lot of listening for a lot of time to try to understand the emotional elements in the presentation of self that people came to the clinic with. And the third thing we did, and we're in the process still of doing it, was to tell everybody who would take the time and go to the trouble to listen to us, that we were working on a very important new area. The results so far have been very interesting. We have developed a technique to invite people to come to this clinic and to share with us a mathematics autobiography. Now, mathematics autobiography is the kind of tale that most people your age and older have never really been asked to tell. It is a review of their lifelong associations with mathematics, how they felt as very young people learning it, what their parents communicated to them about the appropriateness or inappropriateness of their learning it, the last concept in mathematics that they remember mastering, how they felt in class, how the fellows treated them, how the other girls treated them, and a whole very personal and very self-revealing, really, story about their associations with mathematics. Thereupon, and I'll tell you some of the tales we've heard because I think they're interesting later on, thereupon we give them a diagnosis, so to speak, just as if they came to us with a mental health problem, and some recommendations, one of which might be for continued therapy, to come back and see our math teachers and counselors one-to-one or in groups for as long as it takes to help them get the courage up to take a course. Another referral might be to a remedial course that we have designed for our own purposes that is extremely non-threatening and groupy and warm and reassuring. Another might be to work with tutors or to sit in on some modules. We have one called Mathemagic, being taught by a mathematician who once wanted to be a clown and believes that you can make people love mathematics by performing mathematics. And another on a humanistic discussion of mathematics. But whatever the encasement of the solution, everywhere there is an openness for the discussion of feelings. Feelings are the subject of the remediation, not simply learning in a sterile environment or learning cognitively, but really learning feelings. And I'd like to tell you what we are discovering and some of the techniques we're using, which are still fairly rough, in the hopes perhaps of stimulating something similar here, and then we'll open it up to discussion. One of the patterns that seems to be emerging that I find very interesting is that math anxiety, when it strikes, can strike anywhere along the learning cycle. There are some women and men, again, who really stopped learning mathematics in 6th grade or 5th grade with fractions. As we go back along the math autobiography process, we discover that some people really never understood division of fractions, and when they begin to realize that you're not going to laugh at them when they tell you this, they do admit that they were lost somewhere in 5th grade. Another group got lost with word problems, never were able to translate word problems into operations. A third group did all right through junior high and got lost in algebra or trigonometry. A fourth group did very well through high school, got lost or fearful of taking calculus. And we've had one case of a woman at the eve of a dissertation in mathematics who experienced, for all intents and purposes, mathematics anxiety. It can strike then at any point in the learning cycle, but what's so fascinating is that when it strikes, the manifestations emotionally are the same. The victim believes, first, that she can never learn what she is currently having trouble learning, that it is absolutely beyond her skills, that she has reached her nemesis. Second, that she never understood any mathematics until that point, that she was a fraud, a fake, that she memorized, and that she fooled her teachers somehow, and even through this dissertation woman, her feelings were the same. And thirdly, that everybody knows exactly how weak and how imperfect her mathematics knowledge is. Now, these manifestations of certainty that you can't do it, of fear that everybody knows you can't do it, of a sense that you faked it all along, are non-rational responses to what is really only a cognitive problem. And the question is, why and where do these come from? We've decided to treat these non-rational responses as a kind of pocket of mental illness, not to go back alone and teach division of fractions or word problems or algebra or calculus, but to try to examine the emotional overlay that accompanies this feeling of failure and to try to understand it. And among the patterns emerging are the following. Females, for reasons of sexual socialization, self-concept, parental pressure, or whatever, do not wish to be visible or audible in their math classes. And this is, in some cases, true from first or second grade on. In some cases, it only begins later. In order to be invisible, they wish to avoid any kind of participation. They want not to ask questions, and they don't. And when you probe these remembered feelings, what you discover is that they were frightened of appearing both too smart, because smart women are not, in mathematics, are not feminine, and too dumb. They were really hoist on a dilemma, a no-win situation, that they were frightened of appearing too smart and appearing too dumb. In some cases, this response was not so irrational. One woman who's a theologian today, in her 30s, a very fine scholar in the field of religious studies, reported that in algebra class, when she made a dumb response to a question, her teacher banged his head against the blackboard 8 times to demonstrate how stupid her answer was, which was on his part, of course, an extremely emotional and irrational response. Others talk with some degree of accuracy, at least in terms of their own feelings. We can't go back, of course, and check their memories, of being severely punished by male students, friends, and females for doing well in mathematics, of being discouraged by parents. And one girl told us that when she was doing very well in mathematics in junior high school and wanted to enter a region-wide contest in mathematics, she discovered that the first prize in that contest was a pair of cufflinks. And she immediately got a very clear message that it was very inappropriate for her to get into that situation. The other manifestations are a belief somehow that mathematics is an external system of logic being imposed upon the learner from the outside. And what we're beginning to speculate about is why certain learners, notably women, perceive the logic of mathematics as external, as an external system being imposed upon them, when really mathematicians will tell you that the logic is, of course, entirely man-made. It's a human system which is really in one's own head. And one possible explanation for this externalization of mathematical logic is perhaps the fear on the part of women that their own minds, if discovered to be rigorous, would be discovered to be male. And so fearful of discovering in their own persons and in their own heads the kind of rigorous, logical, systematic mode of thinking that in this culture we arbitrarily assign to males, they solve that problem, neurotically of course, by imagining that the logic is not in their minds, but is outside. So as we do our therapy, we begin to hear very strange sentences from girls. You say, why don't you like mathematics? And they'll say, because it is too exact and or too logical. And yet they are really locating outside of themselves a logical, rigorous capacity that ought really at that age to be found within themselves. We have decided that some of the problem is sex roles associated, but a lot of the problem is a teaching mode that seems to be particularly common among mathematics teachers. And I am loath to lay blame at the mathematics faculty because parents also play an enormous role in this. But I'd like to present to you, just for your consideration, a slightly exaggerated model, a set of assumptions about teaching mathematics that we are getting from our clients as a description of the mathematics experience they had, and then present you with an alternative model and see whether it makes some sense to you. The traditional teaching learning in the mathematics classroom has some of the following elements, at least as perceived by the victim. And all of what I'm saying is based on perceptions of victims, not on systematic observation of math classrooms. First of all, it is assumed that the teacher knows and the student doesn't, which is, of course, the old authority syndrome. Secondly, the mode of explanation is the teacher tells and the student listens. The teacher does and the student watches. The teacher's thought processes are presumed to be clear, logical, the correct way to think, and the student's role is to listen, to copy, to ask questions about the teacher's thought processes and adapt his or her thought processes to that of the teacher's. In this model, if a student fails to understand something, he or she, the student, is dumb or incapable because the teacher's thought processes are clear and logical, and if the student is having trouble following, it is the student's fault. The way for the student to succeed in this model is to get the right answer even if it does take a memorization process or something rather far from total understanding. Now, the problem with this model, which I've exaggerated for the sake of argument, is as follows. Good memorizers can go only so far, and then they have what Mitchell Lazarus, an educator in Boston, has called the sudden death experience in learning mathematics, which we are hearing from our clients in their retelling of their emotional reactions. Memory just cannot carry you through more complex and higher mathematics. Students can't apply math learned in the classroom to real-world problems. They don't learn how to guesstimate or to make good guesses. They look in a way that is very exaggerated for some rule. We throw problems on the board in our math clinic, and anybody who walks in, student, staff, or client, has a run at the problems. And we notice that the poorer the student, the less confident the student, the more the student will just jump at some rule. Any kind of problem on the board, and they'll run up and say, let x equal. And it's not even clear that there's an unknown. But they somehow can't relax until they put let x equal something on the board and don't stand back and have a long look. Basically, and I'll get back to this a little later, they don't trust their intuition. The less confident the student, the less he trusts his intuition, and of course, much of mathematics is intuitive. Failure means, in this model, or is implied to mean, that the student doesn't have a mathematical mind. This is not implied, as I said, by teachers of English or history. We assume that the student didn't work hard enough, but there is some kind of a mathematical mind mystique which operates only in that student feels it's his fault. And further, students are not called upon to help each other. The mathematics classroom is a competitive atmosphere, problems on the board, people raise their hands, somebody has the right answer, and when the right answer is given, the teacher tends, and within there, this is slightly exaggerated, some teachers take a little longer, but fundamentally, for the teacher, the right answer is a solution and the teacher moves on. Now, an alternative model in our math anxiety classes that we're trying to develop goes something like this, based on assumptions. The most important subject of the class is the student's thought processes, and these must be elicited and examined carefully. That is, we are not teaching mathematics, we are teaching the student how to learn mathematics, and that is more than a semantic distinction. Thus, the teacher is not a fount of all mathematical wisdom, but a kind of detective, looking to solve a mystery, and the mystery is the student's inability to learn what he knows, and other students in the class can participate in solving that mystery. You see, once you change the subject of the class to the learning problem, then other students in the class may be even more perceptive than the teacher in helping solve that problem because other students are closer to the student in trouble. Thus, it follows that it is imperative, the most exciting thing, the most important thing happening in a class is not getting the right answers, but the wrong answers. The most interesting part of a math classroom experience, in a math anxiety classroom, are the errors that the students make, because the errors are clues to the misunderstanding. And the way we deal with this, two techniques that we found very interesting, are, for one thing, teachers put problems on the board and do not give the right answer. Rather, they elicit all the possible answers and go over them all until the right answer becomes something of an anticlimax. Somewhere toward the end of the period, the right answer may or may not be given. Now, this is absolute anathema to traditional teachers of mathematics who are fearful that people will take out with them the wrong answers, but it's our belief that it reduces anxiety and pressure among the students. Each one is presenting, much in the way of a discussion about a poem, his or her own reaction to the problem. Another technique is to have students tape record their thought processes as they do homework problems, and the teacher listens painstakingly to the tape recording. Because through that process, by noting the errors and the misapprehensions, the tutor or teacher can make some very perceptive judgments about the errors. Again, the most important subject matter is the error, not the right answer. And that's a complete turnaround from the traditional approach. The emotional content of the math class has to be dealt with explicitly. We encourage teachers, students, and we have our therapists sit in on some of the classes, stop the class process and talk about what's going on. That there is intimidation at work, that several students in the class have been feeling left behind for the last 10 minutes. It's not a T group entirely, but we use some of the techniques of group process to guarantee that the group is feeling good, on the assumption that if the group isn't feeling good about themselves in that math class, nothing is going to be learned. And we also deal quite explicitly with sex role aspects of mathematics. why males insist on having so much bravado in a math class and why females are so passive and timid. We asked specific questions related to anxiety. How did you feel walking into class today? How did you feel doing your problems? And we use psychologists very actively in the learning process. Now, these techniques are more than just how-tos. I hope I made clear to you, they are based on very different assumptions about what is the role of the teacher and what is supposed to be going on in the math class. And the goal, of course, is to desensitize the math learner to the problem. That is our major goal. Whatever she remembers or doesn't in the math learning process is less important, that she finally has one positive experience in learning mathematics. Now, there are many other techniques that other people are developing, spatial relations intuition and others, but I'd like to concentrate on a dimension of this problem that I think puts it in center stage for feminism. The advantages of conquering an anxiety about mathematics in a learning situation are not merely that one is going to become more competitive in an occupational environment, although to be sure, one is. There is nothing that will hold women back more than a fear of tables, a fear of graphs, and a fear of quantitative analysis in most fields. The most important benefit from dealing with this issue is that it has a spillover effect into other areas of competence in the female's psyche, and it really seems to increase general self-esteem. And I'd like to dwell a little bit on that because I think there's been inadequate attention given among psychologists to a phenomenon that is emerging out of our math clinic experience. The phenomenon that behavior, particularly among females, is task-specific. That a female who is exceedingly competent in a social skills situation, able to run a home effortlessly, to bring up children, to play a role in her community, can, in a certain task situation, become paralyzed of will, paranoid, panic. And that this pocket of mental illness, as we're calling it, which is related to tasks that are outside of her experience and outside of her ken, can serve to undermine the good feeling she has about herself coming from her other activities. Most of the generalizations about women that you've been hearing about in psychology and elsewhere describe women and men in very global terms. Women are more passive than men, women are less independent than men, women take less initiative than men, and so on. I think none of these really holds across all tasks, but that these are phenomenon, these are characteristics of females in situations in which they are frightened or they have been persuaded are not normal for them to participate in. So out of the anxiety clinic that was designed really to deal with mathematics, we think we are touching on an area through which we can deal with a lot of other female problems. And to say it perhaps very radically, I would say that asking the question, how do you feel about mathematics now? How did you feel about mathematics when you were an adolescent? How did your parents feel about your feelings about mathematics? Is as fruitful a question to ask of a post-adolescent or adult woman as how did you feel about your parents or how do you feel about your relationships? It's a question that gets into her self-image, her self-concept, and her feelings about her relationship to the world. And it's for that reason that I think the initial impulse on my part, namely to increase the competence of women through the educational system so that they could go out and be more competitive professionally, has shifted in my mind from that narrow occupational competency concern to a discovery that I think will hold that if you can successfully aid a young woman in conquering mathematics and science anxiety, you can successfully aid her in conquering numerous other role conflicts about herself that she has brought with her into adulthood. And I think that's a very exciting possibility, even though we don't have the firm data to support it. I would say that if we could bottle our clinic and move it into YWCA's, colleges where there's interest, any consciousness-raising groups, if women could address themselves to their feelings about mathematics, although it sounds far-fetched, we might be able to move them substantially along the way to autonomy, intellectual independence, and higher self-esteem. And that if we don't address this problem, that no amount of legislation or affirmative action or sex role awareness is going to have the lasting effect on their psyches that dealing with mathematics anxiety can have. I'd like to stop and open this for discussion to hear your own experiences or your reaction to this thesis, because I'm concerned that I may not have persuaded you yet, and I'd like to be sure I have. Yeah.
Would it be possible, though, that even though women have gone through desensitization in terms of getting over their anxiety, that the anxiety would come like that when they got back to math classes, that where the teacher took the same kind of...
The question is a good one. Supposing we put women through desensitization and then back into an ordinary conventional mathematics class, won't they be intimidated all over again? And obviously, if we did that, we wouldn't be succeeding. We have taken the position that the teaching of mathematics in this country is going to remain imperfect. And that as feminists with limited resources and limited time, what our goal is, very explicitly, is to provide a parallel support system such that women can survive in an imperfect system. The other approach is what the new math people did 15 years ago, which is to tackle the whole teaching of mathematics, K through senior in college, and that is not our strategy. Our strategy is to strengthen the female's psyche such that when she goes into the imperfect system, she becomes a very demanding learner. A demanding learner who will not allow the teacher to continue until it's clear to her, who will seek out other resources to help her comprehend, instead of buying into the belief system that her failure to understand is her own personal failure. Now that is our goal, and to the extent we succeed, we will assist women in surviving in the imperfect system. We have no illusions that we can change the imperfect system. There are some other things we think we might be able to do that I could tell you about, but our goal is to permit a woman to feel good enough about herself and learning math to go into the worst classroom and to get out of it what she needs. That's really the theory. Yes?
I think no matter how bad the teaching may be, if you're successful, then women would at least have the same chance as men in those classes.
At least they'll have the same chance as men in those classes. That's right. And they may indeed be helping their male colleagues do a little better. Yeah. Any other comments? Yes. It's believed by some that it is a congenital failure in brain development of females. That's why they don't do well in math, yes. I don't believe that, but it is believed by some. Right. This woman is pointing out that there's a controversy over the role of sex stereotyping and the role of brain development. I'd like to make a comment about that, and my position is that I'm political. I'm not primarily a researcher. In fact, I'm the sort of political person who takes the research that confirms my previously held opinions and tends to ignore the ones it doesn't. But I'd like to make a comment about that. It is possible that through differential toys, building toys given to boys and doll toys given to girls, as well possibly as differential rate of development, that indeed young males and young females may enter school with males having less verbal skills, fewer verbal skills, less developed verbal skills, and females having less developed spatial skills. I went into some of this in my article in Ms. Magazine. Now let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this is a demonstrated fact, that measurably most boys are superior in spatial relations, age 6, and inferior in verbal skills than most girls. Have a look from this perspective at the elementary school curriculum. What is taught and retaught and taught again for 6 years, really? Verbal and linguistic skills. Elementary school is like one big remedial program for boys. When and under what circumstances and how often is spatial relations skills taught in elementary school? We did a survey of elementary school curricula and asked a whole lot of superintendents this question, and the answer is never. The closest any school system gets to teaching and developing spatial relations for all their children is in map reading, which is one of those optional subjects that's sometimes taught and sometimes is not. So assuming that the data were in, which it isn't, and assuming that females do have a disadvantage, or a disability if you like, in terms of spatial relations because of toys and so on, We could argue that the elementary school curriculum has been designed to bring males up to the level at which they can compete successfully with females by providing all the remedial reading and the remedial writing and the remedial verbal skills. I'm not prepared to, make that statement, but I do believe that when you have, or not to be quoted anyway, but when you observe what is considered to be a crisis by educators in the reading and study skills area, and observe the absence of remedial math, the absence of math specialists, and above all, the absence of spatial relations development, you do begin to wonder why children are being taught the way they are. Yes?
Well, I'm not sure whether this is a question or a statement, but the last thing you said really struck me because I've observed education in a country where everyone was expected to learn several foreign languages. And this thing you're saying about people, having inability to learn math is something that many people there who have the ability to learn math experience in foreign languages, particularly males experience this. And there are names for it. They have names for it, like word blindness. And men tend to suffer in that particular country, especially men who are oriented to science, because they can't pass their language courses, which are required courses. And I wonder if, implicit in what you just said, if our whole system then is geared to protect people who have inferior language learning skills from ever failing in this
You said it, I didn't. It does provide, I'd like to expand on the language versus spatial a little bit, because I do believe, without having the credentials to make this as a statement, that whether or not this is a zero-sum game, whether or not you're either verbal or spatial, and maybe most of us are potentially both, there is a preferred way of knowing for a person who reads early. Reading becomes a source of information. It's an effortless and pleasant experience, a very nice way to know. And I don't believe we teach mathematics with sufficient prose. One of my self-assignments this year is to write a little supplementary text for high school students, which is going to present mathematical concepts entirely in paragraphs, with no symbols and no formulas, introducing in the same way we would introduce a complex idea in history or English with the use of language. And in the process of mapping out this plan, I am discovering, and again we picked this up from our clients' math autobiographies, that for many of them the ambiguity in language in which mathematics or arithmetic was presented provided them with real crises. One woman told us, and you can understand what a trusting relationship it is when you hear how frank these people are, that she was turned off from math and became nervous about it when she discovered, in 3rd grade I suppose, or 5th grade, that when you multiply fractions, you do not increase their value. Now for her, the word multiply was the most salient fact in that unit. She had an association with multiply, and if you check your dictionary in the Bible, you'll find out that she's pretty close to right. It does have something to do with increase, and fractions were presented to her, and multiplication of fractions presented to her without any caveat about the fact that you are now going to enter a world in which language becomes ambiguously or actually inconsistently used. Another example that comes out of our interaction with our clients is the use of the word of, again with fractions, that a part of something, of implied division, really in fractions is a multiplication problem. 1/3 of 1/2, for those who can remember, is a multiplication. The answer is, 1/6. Now, these are elements that to the math teacher or to the observer of a classroom might seem extremely irrelevant, but another victim told us that she was disturbed by the careless use of the word cancel out. When she was learning to reduce fractions, her teacher said, you cancel them out. Now the word cancel out to somebody who's very word sensitive really means eliminate. And that was clearly not happening to that fraction. It was still there. In fact, the point of canceling out, as far as I can infer from her tale, is that the fraction remains the same in value. So the carelessness in use of language might really render mathematics non-trustworthy. And the overwhelming impression we get from our female victims is that they do not trust that system, which, as I said earlier, they externalize, and they, above all, do not trust themselves. I'll give you an example. We've thrown on the board a problem with some numbers and watched people deal with it. The problem is, without going into it, the kind of problem where something immediately jumps into your mind, a fraction, 4/5, And the confident learner will simply try it out with 4/5 and give the answer a reasonableness test. A female will say, I can't do this at all, I never could, I never would, I never will, goes through her whole number, and then later, if you'll pardon the expression, and later, when we probe and say, now, did you have any thoughts, any ideas, anything jump into your head? She will say, yes, 4/5 jumped into my head, but I knew it was wrong because it was in my head. And that is the problem. Absolute lack of faith in intuition. The very same person in another situation, social, interpersonal, verbal, writing, editing, will go much on intuition, as most of us do in much of our work. We fly on intuition with confidence. But in this area, which has been designated foreign turf, not a place where you're supposed to be, she feels, I can't trust the idea because it's in my head. And that's really the tragedy of this kind of problem. Yes, in the back. So what you're suggesting is we carry a big stick. Of course. There are unlimited, there are numerous and repeated attempts to help elementary school teachers teach mathematics, and within these four walls, and I say it hesitantly because I am a feminist and I consider all women to be my sisters, elementary school teachers are among the most obvious victims of math anxiety. And if one asks me for the policy implications of what we're discovering, I would recommend highly that the teaching of mathematics be put in the hands of a specialist from kindergarten on, and not given over to persons who don't like it and are fearful of it, rather than an enormous and wasteful effort to conquer individually the mathematics anxiety of a lot of teachers. In other countries, and I was on a tour asking questions like this, mathematics specialization is provided as early as 4th grade, and sometimes even earlier. Children are permitted, encouraged to change classes. Now, you may wonder why we in this country never got into that system, why we wait until 7th grade to give the child a specialist. The reason is a belief, again, related so much to sex role and family mythology, that a young child needs a mother substitute in a teacher, and to go from one person to another person to learn music or math would be psychologically disconcerting. There was a long debate on this subject 30 or 40 years ago, and I think the children are the victims of the decisions that were made. But what we're concerned about, and what I'm here to sell, is the idea that one can take damaged people who have been poorly taught and who have lost all manner of confidence in themselves in this entire field, which spills over into many, many other technical areas, and you can repair them. And you can repair them at a reasonable rate of speed. Let me give you an example. Our students, clients who report, I got lost in fractions, presume that to catch up will take them as many years as have passed. That since they got lost in 4th grade, and if they can subtract their current age from age 9, which many of them can't, they can come up with something like, it'll be 13 years, before I'm ready for calculus. Well, that really isn't true, and we've had some very interesting experiences in teaching all of arithmetic in 4.5 learning hours to adults. It's familiar. They've got much more sophisticated minds than, of course, they had when they were little, and they are in a position of greater confidence and able to demand answers and help. And we brought in a specialist on an experimental basis to teach in 3 1.5-hour sessions 3 different levels of mathematics. He taught all of arithmetic to one group that was blocked at the fractions level. He taught all of algebra, starting with a simple word problem and teaching everything through, say, intermediate algebra in 4 1.5-hour sessions. And then he taught a course he called Calculus Without Infinities for persons who had mastered algebra but were too scared to try calculus. Now, the question is, what did they learn and how much did they know later? We don't know, but we believe that they had an experience of discovering that their adult minds were capable of dealing with things successfully that their childlike minds were not, and that they had at least one positive experience in learning math that would help them move on. So one of the other mythologies is that if you missed it, you know, you've had it. And we find it very exciting to try out this review of arithmetic. We call it analytic arithmetic. And it is non-threatening because it is, after all, something everybody vaguely remembers, and it can be successfully completed all of those years in 4.5 hours. Yeah.
Would you now help me to identify and understand whatever problems I might have, and I don't have a local remedial session? What would you suggest?
What do you do? Well, I think the local sessions are really wise. Basically, the technique for starting a group is to find a counselor with counseling skills and a math teacher with math teaching skills to work with a group of people. And the trick is not to do any math learning for at least 3 sessions. 3 sessions should be spent on math autobiographing around the room, with the counselor participating as counselors do, pointing out inconsistencies or showing patterns, and the group establishing a kind of trust among themselves. The math teacher can participate in the initial sessions only insofar as it's useful to clarify some kind of dreadful misstatement that's being made. I've heard a math teacher say to a woman who confided that she couldn't master division of fractions. He was in this session, this autobiographical part of the session, and he said, well, one of the reasons you had trouble is, you know, you never use it in real life. You never have to invert a fraction and multiply it. You know, you don't do division of fractions in normal life. She says, you don't? She said, no, that's why you forgot it. She said, I did. And she moved, you know, one step closer to liking herself a little better. In the 4th session, the first math concept is introduced in a teaching situation, but by then that group has a lot of strength and cohesion and can represent a counterweight to the force of the teacher's authority, and is a group supporting one another and helping one another. And we try to teach just 3 concepts in the 3 remaining sessions: the number line, some simple graphing, or something like percentages and proportions. And at the end of it, ask in an exit interview if the client is ready for some kind of remedial class in an imperfect world, with or without continuing psychological support, or wants to go through this kind of session again. Now, the benefits of this are for us that we're learning a great deal more about math anxiety, its elements, its causes, and its manifestations, but also the people in that group are discovering they're not alone. Other people have these problems. They are dredging up things they were very ashamed of for a very long time, and they are beginning to have one reasonably good experience in discussing mathematics. By yourself, it's harder, unless you find a willing person to talk with you about it, because it is as profound and as repressed a set of problems as any others, as sexuality. And just as one can't, beyond a certain point, cure one's own neurosis without some help, I don't think one can cure math anxiety without help either. Yes?
Your emphasis seems to be on the individual's problem. Are you, or is anybody else, working on re-educating math educators?
Well, as I said earlier, that's a whole other, if I were younger, maybe. Yes, there are a lot of people re-educating math educators, and always the technique, the system is the same. It is to revise the math curriculum. And we seem to be the only ones talking about allowing the imperfect math curriculum to stay and dealing explicitly with the emotional overlay through psychological techniques. So, in answer to your question, no, we are not redesigning math learning. There are people elsewhere, there are national educational laboratories that are working on this, and it always follows the same pattern. Mathematicians figure out brilliantly the best way to teach, and let's assume for the sake of argument it is the best way to teach. They create materials at a federal expense. They go out into the field to train teachers who don't use the materials, don't use the techniques, and don't respond very well to the retraining because of their own anxiety. Our issue, our problem that we've defined for ourselves to solve is repairing damage in adults defined as college age and above, who are willing to make at least some commitment to doing something about it. Yes?
I think the passivity in math classes is pretty common to the hard science classes also.
Mm-hmm.
That's been my experience my personal experience where I'm hesitant to give an answer if I'm not sure, if I don't remember the exact line that was in the book. And I won't say it, I'll
Well, we have one case. She says she has trouble asking questions or answering questions in a science class because she's afraid it'll be the wrong answer. And all I can say to you is that somebody in that classroom, probably the teacher, but also maybe the other students, has communicated the fact that giving the wrong answer is a serious blunder. I mean, that's an atmosphere of a classroom. Giving a wrong answer in a different kind of class, which is searching together for truth cooperatively, might be a very positive contribution. But I do want to tell you about one case of a young woman who has done fairly well in math and has gone through linear algebra in my university, which is fairly rigorous, and has never asked a question in a math class ever in her life. She asks questions in other classes. She is capable of and good at learning math on her own. She cannot bring herself to ask a question. And we relate that, tentatively, to this desire on the part of young women to be invisible. You see, if you're on somebody else's turf, where you shouldn't really be, and you feel emotionally that you shouldn't be there, then you should be as quiet and as unobtrusive as possible. Part of the assertiveness in some students in asking questions, demanding information, showing off, is a sense of belongingness. I belong here, this is my turf. And that very same woman will do well in a explication du texte of a French poem, and she will find it easy to reveal her ignorance in my history course and elsewhere. But she is feeling a sense of outsidedness in the classroom, and that is really what is inhibiting her, and of course preventing her from learning. That's our belief. You wanted to ask something else? Yeah. Yes, that is what we're doing. We're giving students an opportunity to express their emotional reaction to what they're learning, and we're allowing them to do it in our classes and outside our classes, and insofar as they go back into the imperfect system, we would set up a psychological support mechanism so that somewhere they can express their feelings. But if you talk to ordinary math teachers about the need to talk about feelings in math class, they will think you're out of your mind. I mean, the one thing that mathematics they think has nothing to do with is feelings. We're much more responsive to that in the humanities. We are much more welcoming of a statement that as I read that poem I felt, or it reminded me of, or my personal sense of it is, than they are in mathematics. And they would argue it's because it's inappropriate to mathematics, and I would argue it's simply inappropriate as a matter of tradition. That anywhere where learners are interacting with teachers, feelings are operating. And either they're going to be discussed or they're going to become inhibitors. That's a strong statement. Did you want? Why we think the fear of failure or the fear of success is greater in math classes than it is elsewhere. There are a number of reasons. One of them is that mathematics does have right and wrong answers. I mean, one can argue history does too. I mean, if somebody writes down Civil War started in 1902, we do say wrong. But there is a certain kind of finality about the answer, and one's self is a little bit on the line, particularly in an atmosphere where the right answer takes on large proportions and large significance. In the alternate model, the right answer is anticlimactic, and the most important thing is the process and the learning. So that's why the fear of failure may be for boys and girls greater in the math classroom. But what we're finding out is that the most significant operation among women in the math classroom is fear of success, not fear of failure. Success is far more dangerous to that young adolescent female in mathematics because it tells her, she fears, something about herself that is disturbing, that she is, has a masculine mind. And that's very frightening when you are not yet sure whether you are a woman. Yes? Yes, that's a very good point. Are we worrying about masculine or feminine minds or some sort of superior intellect? There is some research in Germany that has studied attitudes toward mathematics in adolescent girls and finds that there are two elements operating. One of them is just being fearful of being intellectually rigorous altogether, and that mathematics is associated with high abstract intellectual rigor. And so in some ways it is the ultimate fearful demonstration that one is mathematical, that one is masculine, that being intellectual is threatening as well. Let me say it more positively. I believe that a number of women who have done reasonably well in the humanities, or in languages or in sex-appropriated fields, who were extremely high achievers and really rather brilliant, selected English and history and languages as a compromise with reality, that they could excel and use their good minds and let themselves go intellectually in fields that were sex appropriate. And that the selection process has not been made on rational grounds or on grounds of taste or even of interest, but the interest and the taste and the decision has followed upon a decision unconsciously made to make a deal with reality. The deal is you may be brilliant if you're brilliant in a sex-appropriate field. And that really accounts for the clustering of women in these fields much, much more than any kind of brain difference. I believe that to be true. I saw. Yes. What can you do? Well, I tell people take them out of ballet class and put them in math class the minute they show changes. Second grade, the data shows that girls and boys do equally well in arithmetic right up through sometimes as late as 10th grade. And the crisis occurs at about 10th grade. But one of the other things the data shows is that wherever you test them, girls think that boys do better, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Girls and teachers assume that boys do better in arithmetic, even where they don't. And further, that if you give girls and boys a matched ability, a test, and lie to them about their performance, you tell them that they did less well than they did, substantially less well, in math, the boys will challenge the judgment of the teacher. Say, there must have been a mistake in scoring, I know I did better than that, and the girls will accept the judgment of the teacher, so that even their achievement somehow does not feed their confidence. And that's the issue that is the most refractory in this whole analysis. What happens in 10th grade? The biologists want to tell us math becomes more spatial, more geometric, girls aren't spatial, therefore they do badly. The environmentalists suggest that there's a great deal of pressure on the 10th grade girl to be popular and feminine and non-rigorous, non-masculine, and that's going into effect. But what happens to the confidence? What happens to the trust and intuition? What happens to the trust in self? Where does it go, and how can one recapture it? That's really the elements that are, that inspire us. You're next, yes. Well, one of the truths, now that I'm over 40, I can let out great truths about life. And one of the truths about life is, frankly, that we don't know what kind of minds we have until somebody tells us. And one of the things we're preventing everybody from discovering is what kind of mind he or she has, by categorizing and classifying and grading and measuring and giving back, the feedback, such that the fears of incompetence are really prevail. Whereas one of the most interesting processes in growing up would be, under other circumstances, to discover what kind of mind one had. And if one came to college with that as one's goal, let me discover what kind of mind I have, then you wouldn't have to require courses. Students would voluntarily, with curiosity and interest, explore all kinds of subjects on the campus. But instead, by the time they get to us, they are programmed to think of themselves as having certain skills that they do well and certain others that they do badly. They don't believe these poor skills can be conquered, and they never move out of what I call the comfort zone. They take a cluster of courses that require the same kinds of mental skills, reading or writing or math or labs, and are terrified to dip into the other areas of the university. But one of the nice things about growing even older is that one can begin to relax and watch one's own mind develop and see what kind of mind one really has. And it no longer matters what they say because they stop, believe it or not, they stop testing you. One of the joys. I haven't had a test in 20 years, and it's really one of the privileges of growing older. Are there any other, yes, in the back. Well, that's just my way of saying ever vigilant. Actually, there's some data from small samples that shows a severe change in two things, performance and in avoidance of mathematics. There are a number of females who do fairly well and then don't study any more math after 10th grade. So we can't, of course, judge whether their ability went down. We know their performance goes down because they never learn anything again. There was a study done at this university in the home economics school that hasn't been made public yet, but that indicates that it doesn't even matter how much schooling they had or in what percentile in their classes they were. The females entering had absolutely inadequate algebra to function in the modern world. So sometime between 8th and 9th grade and senior high, statistically, not necessarily your daughters, but statistically, your daughters are going to either fail in mathematics intentionally or stop taking mathematics because they are convinced that they're going to fail. And that's the issue that has to be addressed. Well, math tutoring, math clinics, taking mathematics very seriously, trying to demonstrate its utility, working with their teachers, killing all the boys in the class. I mean, the range is, depends on where you want to spend the rest of your life, but the range is wide, yes. You lied about your grades in math. Okay, everybody hear that? That's a solution to the problem. Just lie about your grades in math, and if possible, date boys from another high school, right? That was my solution. You just keep going out with boys from different high schools, and when you run out of high schools, you leave town and go to college, yes. The pressure is really very significant. Is there anybody willing to share with us a math, personal math? I mean, it's not the best place, but I am gathering impressions, and I think it would be interesting to have a few Iowa stories. Yes. Yeah. She's talking about competing with some males, and if I can just interpolate a comment, one of the results of Martina Horner's research on fear of success in women is that it is increased in whenever there's a competitive situation with males, that females feel not only out of place in the masculine turf of mathematics, but they feel very, very out of place competing intellectually with males. So in any field in which males dominate, the fear of success in females will be increased. And that is a reported finding from a lot of review of very bright women's behavior in competitive situations. That's why, again, the compromise with reality that I call majoring in English is a compromise with reality, because here you can shine, you can use your mind, and you will not have too great a degree of confrontation with males competing for honors in the same field. I found myself 3/4 of the way to an English major as an undergraduate without ever having really decided that I wanted to major in English. I had to wrench myself out of it. There's nothing wrong with English, but it was this, somehow one was put on a track between the guidance counselor and the friends and everybody telling you which courses to take and the teachers giving you positive reinforcement. I was 3/4 of the way toward an English major. I'd gotten the highest grade of every freshman in an introductory science course. The teacher had never suggested I take another, and I was almost an English major before I pulled myself together. I mean, the degree of pressure is impossible for us to really measure. It's very substantial. Yeah.
I went to high school in a suburban part of Cincinnati, Ohio, and got very good grades in math and sciences. Was the only woman in a fourth-year math class, and took all the vocational ability tests at that point. And my high school counselor said, "Susan, you've done really well in math and science. Perhaps you should marry a farmer."
That too is a solution. Yes.
I was going to spare everybody mine, but
Um,
I was very bad at arithmetic. But as soon as I hit algebra, I loved it. I did well in algebra. I did very well in geometry, and I was astonished at that time that girls who I knew as smart in other subjects were having trouble with geometry because it was like a game. It was delightful and fun. But I never took advanced algebra or trig because I wasn't going into engineering. I wasn't interested in going in engineering, and I was told that only engineers took advanced algebra and trig. And so I didn't, besides the fact that I had fun before, I decided other subjects were fun, so I'll take other fun subjects. And when I got to college, I was in a girls' school, and they had a very interesting course, which called Introduction to College Math. The only thing I was eligible for, because I couldn't take college algebra because I hadn't had second-year high school algebra. And all of a sudden, I discovered after I got to college that I needed it. So I took this other course. So I always felt, although it was a beautiful course dealing with mathematical systems, Boolean algebra, and a lot of things that had been at that time, this is before the new math, and graduate level, were taught at the freshman level of college. Hey, this is really neat. I'd like to take more math. My mother encouraged me to become a math major, and the teacher encouraged me, and everybody encouraged me. And then I got married. And because I love math so much, I took a class with my husband. And he at that time was a graduate student, and it was a course in symbolic logic. And we studied together. And I realized that he understood it much better than I did. And from that time on, I never looked at the
Grounds for divorce. You spoke a minute ago. There was somebody in the middle there. I see a hand. I didn't see the face attached to the hand. In the back row? No. Yes.
It just seems that most of the people who've been talking have been math majors, and they're competent in math, so I thought I'd be aggressive and represent the other side as me feeling myself totally incompetent in math. And sort of a typical description that you've been giving is around high school. I began to feel that math was cold and clinical, and my male and female friends who were interested in math were also cold and clinical, and that just didn't fit my personality.
That's a very frequent report that we get, a rejection of mathematics because of its coldness, and therefore a rejection of people who are good in mathematics, not liking mathematicians or scientists, not really wanting to be one of them. But that can also be interpreted, again, as the male-female. There weren't a whole lot of female mathematicians who were warm and loving. In fact, what the most famous mathematician, creative mathematician, is a German woman named Emmy Noether. And for those who don't know, German has 3 articles, a neuter, a masculine, and a feminine. And normally, an affectionate way of describing a woman is to say die and use her last name, the feminine article. And Emmy was such a good mathematician that everybody called her Der Noether. That was their way of acknowledging her brilliance as a mathematician. There's a little bit of evidence for the differential attitudes towards self and math that's coming out of Harvard. Harvard has a pre-calculus course now that they don't tell anybody about. Wherever I go, I tell everybody that Harvard has a pre-calculus course because they're so snooty that they don't want anybody to know. But they've been teaching Math A for 5 years, very quietly, to at least 70 students a semester. And they get equal numbers of males and females, but they get their males and females in very different ways, I was told by the instructor. The females sign up for Math A at the outset because they know they're not ready for calculus, and this group of females anyway wants to get ready for calculus. The males don't come to Math A at all until after the first hour exam in calculus, when they flunk it and they come in. And it really, we laugh, but in many ways, as an educator and a mental health observer, I must say the boys are infinitely to be envied. I mean, they have enough confidence, indeed it's too much, it's bravado, to think that it's worth trying, to see if they can get through calculus with an adequate background, and the girls of equal or better ability don't have the courage to try. So by mid-semester, there are 50% males and females in the class of Math A at Harvard, but for very, very different reasons. It's very difficult, by the way, for a male to admit math problems, because just as it is inappropriate for girls to be good in math, it's inappropriate for boys to be bad in math or poor at mechanical techniques. And I am waiting for someone to develop very sophisticated modes of dealing with males with math anxiety, because the males who come to us with math anxiety have so many layers of bravado between their anxiety and the clinician that it takes forever to unpeel. They are forever telling us that they could do very well if they only worked, and they're just waiting till next semester to take a course, and they're sure they have a lot of native ability, and it's really much easier for us to get at the anxiety in the female because it is less clouded with all of this, macho kind of excuse. And we feel very sorry for them because it'll take them much longer to get at the root of the problem. Are there any other? Let me end with my favorite anecdote about the implications of all of this. I was on an airplane one day, I've told some of you this story, on a very clear night after a very long day in Washington, closing my eyes and snoozing off, when a woman who turned out later to be in her early 30s, mother of three, very lovely, mature person, clutched my arm for assistance because she was frightened. And I kind of opened one eye to see if we turned upside down or whether the motor was off or the wing, I hadn't noticed. But it turned out, really, we were in exactly the same position, and it was starlit sky and nice, quiet flight, and this lady was scared of the flight. The reason it appeared, after many, many minutes of talk, she wanted to talk, she needed some help, and wanted to share her problems with me, was that that lady did not know why we were in the air. She had no idea that the forward thrust of the engines had something to do with our staying up. She didn't know what the wings function was, or that we might land on one engine. She didn't know we were being followed second by second by radar from 2 different airports. She had absolutely no familiarity with what is, of course, the 20th century's great, gift to those of us who travel, airplanes. And when we finished this conversation, I said to her as lovingly as I could, if I knew as little about why we were in the air as you did, I'd be scared too. And I think there really is a layer of fear that prevents some women, and the most exaggerated cases of these are called agoraphobia, which is a most exaggerated problem that women have, which is fear of going outside the house. And this is, of course, in its most extreme form. But a fear of the world, which comes from not having the tools to comprehend the world. And that, perhaps in the end, is our ultimate goal. Thank you very much.